I never imagined my father would look small. Not weak, not frail, small. As if the truth in my hand had peeled away the larger-than-life persona he had worn my entire childhood. We stood in the middle of the south pasture, the winter grass flattened under our boots, the air still and brittle with cold. The morning sun cast long shadows behind us, exaggerating the distance between who he thought he was and what I had discovered. In my gloved fingers I held a document, yellowed by time, creased from careful folding, and weighted with a century of silence. At the top, written in looping cursive unmistakably of another era, were the words, "Deed of Conveyance, Eleanor B. Whitcomb." My great-grandmother, the matriarch whose name had rarely been spoken in our family, except in passing, as though she were a footnote rather than the woman whose sweat and sacrifice built the land beneath our feet. My father stood across from me, his jaw working as though grinding invisible stones between his teeth. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "put that away." Now. I didn't. I unfolded it fully and let the wind catch the edges. His eyes flicked to the handwriting, then to my face, then back again, as if he were trying to rearrange the facts into something more convenient. "It's legitimate," I said softly. "I had it authenticated." "You had no right." "No right to what?" I asked. "To the truth." Something fractured in his expression, something sharp, defensive, almost panicked. He lunged forward as if to snatch the deed from my hands, but I stepped back. The sudden movement startled a flock of crows from the nearby oak. Their wings cracked the air like warning shots. "I built everything on this land," he growled. "I made it what it is." "You made it what you wanted," I corrected. "But it was never yours to build." He froze, the words hitting him harder than the winter wind ever could. He stared at the deed again, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw the truth reflected in his eyes, recognition. Guilt. Fear. He whispered, "You weren't supposed to find that." And that was when I knew. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't a clerical oversight. This wasn't a misunderstanding lost to time. This was betrayal, deliberate, buried, and protected for 50 years. Before I could speak again, my father turned away from me, shoulders hunched, breathing shallow. I stood there gripping the deed, realizing the quiet war that had shaped my whole life without me even knowing. I didn't yet understand the depth of what he had taken. I didn't know how far the deception reached. I didn't know how much of my family's story had been rewritten. But I would. Soon. And what I was about to uncover would tear the Ellison family open like a wound that had festered too long beneath a bandage of tradition and silence. My name is Margaret Ellison. And at 68 years old, I thought my life had settled into a gentle, predictable rhythm. I had retired from a long career as a school librarian, a job I cherished for its quiet order and the delicate way children bloom when handed stories big enough to hold their dreams. I had raised 2 daughters, Leanne and Mira, both strong women with the courage I didn't develop until much later in life. And for the most part, I believed myself to be a woman who understood her world. But understanding, I've learned, is often nothing more than accepting the story we're given. I grew up with 2 brothers, both younger, both louder, both more carefully groomed to inherit the identity my father crafted for them. I was the eldest, the responsible one, the helpful one, but also the quiet one. My father mistook my gentleness for pliability. He mistook my introspection for lack of resolve. He mistook my silence for agreement. Many men of his generation made the same error. I married young, loved deeply, divorced quietly, and built a life that was steady rather than remarkable. I kept journals, cooked elaborate soups in winter, and walked the property lines every spring, never questioning whether the land beneath my feet was truly mine to tread. But with age comes a kind of clarity I never expected. The heart grows softer while the spine grows firmer. The voice we spent decades quieting finally learns to speak, not loudly but truthfully. When Aunt Ruth passed and left me several trunks of family heirlooms, I considered it sentimental clutter. I opened them out of duty, not curiosity. I expected photographs, letters, maybe a cookbook or a quilt pattern. I did not expect a deed. I did not expect my great-grandmother's elegant handwriting. I did not expect to find a century-old secret with my name written into its legacy. But there it was, a document that would reshape everything I believed about my family, our land, and my father. And perhaps what surprised me most was not the discovery itself, but the quiet, resolute certainty that rose within me the moment I read it. At 68, I realized I was no longer willing to carry the weight of other people's silence. I was ready, finally, to carry my own truth. Growing up, The Ellison family was shaped less by conversation and more by hierarchy. My father sat at the top, stern, articulate, commanding, and the rest of us arranged ourselves beneath him like planets tethered to an unmoving sun. My mother, Helen, was soft-spoken, her life orbiting service. Meals prepared without complaint, disagreements swallowed before they could sour the air, small dreams tucked away in drawers she rarely opened. She loved us deeply, but love doesn't erase fear. She feared my father's temper, not violent, but cold, sharp, and humiliating in a way that could make even a grown woman feel 12 years old again. My brothers, Daniel and Keith, grew into versions of my father, though neither wore authority as easily. They were boys who learned early that obedience was rewarded and questioning was punished. They accepted the idea that the land would one day belong to them because it was presented as natural law, like gravity or rain. I was different, or so my father said often enough that the label stuck. Too sentimental, too cautious, too attached to things that don't matter. He meant books. He meant quiet. He meant compassion. He didn't see value in any of it. Still, I stayed close to my family. Habits form grooves in the mind, and I walked those grooves for decades. Holidays gathered us around the long dining table, where conversations flowed between my father and brothers while I poured wine and asked about the garden or the weather. Even as an adult, I played the role expected of me. But fault lines existed beneath every interaction. The land, 64 acres of rolling fields, a creek that glimmered like a polished blade, a grove of oak trees older than statehood, was the unspoken centerpiece of our family identity. My father spoke of it as though it were a kingdom and he its rightful monarch. He never explained why he felt so certain. He never referenced paperwork, probate, or inheritance. He simply declared, "This land has always been ours." And the frightening thing was how easily everyone believed him. When the brothers talked of future plans, selling off the north pasture, building rental cabins, leasing parts to a hunting club, my father nodded with approval, as if granting permission from a throne only he could see. I watched quietly. I always had. But small moments stayed with me. The way my father locked certain filing cabinets. The way he grew irritated when anyone asked about family history. The way my grandmother once reached for my hand and whispered, "Don't ever let them tell you what belongs to you." I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. And when I unfolded Great-Grandma Eleanor's deed for the first time, the entire architecture of our family's silence snapped into focus. The land, according to her, had never been meant for the men at all. It had been meant for the women. And I was her chosen heir. The deed, dated 1927, began typically enough. Legal descriptions of boundaries, coordinates, and acreage. But the heart of the document lay beneath Great-Grandma Eleanor's careful script. To be held in stewardship by my daughters and their daughters after them. Not their husbands. Not their sons. Not the men of the Ellison bloodline who had always assumed inheritance was their birthright. Her words were clear. The land was a matrilineal legacy. My grandmother, Ada, was her eldest daughter. And according to the deed, Ada's eldest daughter would inherit the stewardship next. My grandmother had one daughter. My mother had one daughter. And that daughter was me. The realization stole my breath. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, the paper fragile between my fingers. I reread the passage again and again, thinking perhaps I had misunderstood. But the meaning remained unambiguous. I was the rightful heir. Not my father. Not my brothers. Me. So how had the truth been buried? The answer emerged slowly as I pieced together old letters in the trunk. When my grandmother fell ill, my father had helped organize her affairs. He had collected documents, stacked them neatly, and taken them home for safekeeping. After she died, he became the de facto manager of the land, since my mother was too grieving and too gentle to challenge him. My mother's passing years later sealed his authority. Without her soft reminders or my grandmother's stern eyes, no one questioned him. He claimed the land, declared it his legacy, and my brothers followed suit without hesitation. But he never filed a legal transfer, never probated a will, never established ownership formally. Because he couldn't. The deed didn't allow it. He built decades of control on a false foundation, praying no one would ever look beneath it. And to be fair, I never would have, until Aunt Ruth left me the trunks. As the betrayal settled in my chest, it felt less like anger and more like grief. Grief for the women whose voices had been dismissed. Grief for my mother, who must have known something but felt too small to fight. Grief for the years I had spent shrinking myself to keep the peace. He hadn't simply taken land. He'd taken lineage. He'd taken truth. He'd taken the power great-grandma Eleanor had intended for her daughters. And now I had a choice: let the silence continue, or restore what had been stolen. At 68, for the first time in my life, I chose confrontation. I knew emotion wouldn't win this battle. My father had spent a lifetime dismissing my feelings as irrelevant. I wouldn't give him the opportunity to do it again. What I needed was proof: airtight, unemotional, irrefutable proof. So I began quietly. First, I brought the deed to a preservation specialist who carefully examined the ink, paper fibers, and handwriting. She handled it with reverence, as though aware it had carried nearly a century of unanswered questions. After several days, she provided a formal statement verifying its authenticity and age. Next, I visited the county recorder's office. The clerk, a meticulous woman named Sheila, helped me search through decades of property filings. What we found astonished even her. There had been no legal transfer from my grandmother to my father. No will referencing the land. No probate listing. Nothing. The official chain of title ended with my grandmother's generation, and the deed stipulation meant it should have passed to me. My father had been operating on assumption, not law. The third step was contacting an attorney. I found a real estate lawyer named Caroline Baxter, a woman in her 50s with a steady voice and a deliberate manner that inspired immediate confidence. I handed her the deed, the letters, and the county records. She read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Margaret, you have one of the cleanest cases I've ever seen." Meaning what exactly? Meaning the land is yours. Fully. Legally. Without contest. I exhaled slowly, feeling equal parts relief and dread. She must have sensed my hesitation, because she leaned back and chose her next words with care. The law is on your side, but the emotional fallout, that's something you'll need to prepare for. I nodded. I had already imagined the shouting, the accusations, the fractures forming in a family already stressed by decades of unspoken resentment. But the truth, once uncovered, demands either acknowledgement or further deceit. I knew which path I would take. Caroline prepared documents. A formal claim of ownership, a request to correct the county title, a notarized summary of the deed, an evidence packet documenting the lack of legal transfer. Together, these formed a barrier my father couldn't simply bulldoze with his stubborn certainty. The final step was scanning and securing everything: digital copies, printed copies, fireproof storage. If my father tried to destroy the original deed, he wouldn't succeed in erasing its power. By the end of the week, I felt a quiet resolve settle into my bones. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity, the kind that comes only when truth finally rises after being buried for generations. And with that clarity, I knew the confrontation was inevitable. I wasn't the same daughter who once bowed to my father's authority. I was the rightful heir to Eleanor's legacy, and I was ready to reclaim it. The day I confronted them, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Appropriate, I remember thinking. The air felt charged, as though the land itself sensed what was coming. My father and brothers were gathered at the farmhouse kitchen table, poring over maps and financial projections. They were discussing plans to sell the North Pasture, a sale that would have erased a century of family history without a second thought. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching them. My father at the head of the table, Daniel leaning forward with excitement, Keith scribbling notes. 3 men so certain of their authority, they didn't even notice me enter. "May I speak with all of you?" I asked. They looked up. My father frowned. "This really isn't the time, Margaret." "It is," I said, setting the folder on the table. "It concerns the land." Daniel rolled his eyes. "You've never cared about the land." I met his gaze calmly. "That's not true. I simply didn't know it was mine." Silence. Thick, heavy, disbelieving. My father's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" So I explained, simply factually, without embellishment. I laid out the deed. I showed the authenticity certificate. I presented the county records, proving he had never legally inherited the property. My father stared at the documents as though they were written in a language he refused to learn. "This means nothing," he said. "Caroline had warned me this might happen." I reached into the folder and laid down the legal claim. "This means everything." My brothers erupted first. "You're stealing from us. You're tearing the family apart. You don't even care about the land. You're doing this out of spite." I let them vent. Their anger was a shield for their fear, and I recognized the pattern because I had lived in this family long enough to know its rhythms. My father remained silent until the shouting faded. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not disappointment. Something closer to defeat. "You weren't supposed to know," he whispered. And with those 6 words, he admitted everything. I gathered the documents, stood tall, and delivered the sentence that marked the turning point of my life. "I am filing the title correction this afternoon. You may respond through your attorneys." Then I walked out the door, feeling the weight of Eleanor, Ada, and my mother behind me. 3 generations of silenced women whose legacy I was finally reclaiming. Legal battles rarely unfold dramatically. They unravel quietly, thread by thread, until the fabric of a lie simply collapses under its own weight. My father hired a lawyer, an older man who seemed uncomfortable challenging documented truth. Daniel and Keith followed suit, though their attorney came armed with bluster rather than facts. But in the end, none of that mattered. The law was unequivocal. The review board examined the deed, the authenticity reports, the title history, and the lack of legal transfer. They issued their findings in a 6-page statement that concluded, with absolute clarity: "The land belongs to Margaret Ellison." My brothers were stunned. Their outrage sputtered out when faced with unbreakable logic. All their plans, leasing agreements, construction proposals, sale projections, became instantly irrelevant. My father received the news quietly. He didn't rage. He didn't argue. He simply folded the letter and placed it on the table as though laying down a piece of himself he had carried for far too long. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Development companies withdrew. Contractors canceled agreements. Investors pulled out of deals my father had boasted about for years. Survey markers were removed. Equipment hauled away. And with each reversal, my father seemed to shrink further, not physically but spiritually, as though finally facing a truth he had outrun for 5 decades. There was no dramatic downfall, no public humiliation, just a quiet dismantling of false authority. He had spent his life building an identity on land that had never been his to claim. And when the lie dissolved, so too did the version of himself he had projected onto the world. One evening he came to my house. He stood on the porch, hands trembling, not with anger but age. "I thought I was protecting the family," he said. "Were you?" I asked gently. "Or were you protecting control?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I closed the door that night knowing his downfall wasn't something I had caused. It was the inevitable consequence of truth finally resurfacing. Owning the land felt different than merely walking it. I felt its history as I moved across it. The weight of Eleanor's determination, Ada's endurance, my mother's quiet sorrow. The soil held stories I had never been told, and for the first time, I felt worthy of hearing them. I spent weeks restoring what had been neglected, repairing fences, clearing invasive brush, cataloging old trees, and walking the creek at dusk when the water glowed gold beneath the sinking sun. I breathed easier, slept deeper, and felt a sense of belonging I hadn't realized was missing. But ownership didn't erase the emotional fallout. Daniel and Keith avoided me at first. Their pride was wounded, and their resentment simmered. But resentment, when built on entitlement, eventually evaporates under the weight of undeniable truth. Months passed, and slowly, cautiously, they began to speak to me again. Not warmly, but respectfully. My father remained distant. We exchanged muted conversations, careful and brittle, like 2 people trying to rebuild a bridge that had burned not suddenly but over decades. I didn't hate him. I didn't want revenge. I wanted acknowledgement, something small but sincere. One spring afternoon, he asked if he could walk the property with me. We walked in silence until we reached the oak grove. "This land, it was never really mine," he said. "No," I replied softly. "But that doesn't mean you didn't love it." He nodded, eyes glistening in a way I had never seen. I should have told the truth. "Yes," I said, "but we can start from here. Healing doesn't erase harm. It simply allows breath where suffocation once lived." As for the land, I knew exactly what to do with it. I created a stewardship trust, honoring great-grandma Eleanor's original intent. The trustees would always be the women of our family, my daughters, my nieces, and any future daughters they might have. The land would never be sold, never fractured, never commercialized. It would be protected, cherished, preserved. A legacy restored. And as I watched my daughters walk the creek one evening, laughing as the fireflies rose around them, I felt peace settle over me like a warm shawl. The truth had been buried for nearly a century. but it had found its way home. If age has taught me anything, it is that silence is not the same as peace. Silence can hide wounds. It can bury truths too heavy to face. It can create shadows where clarity should live. My family lived in that silence for generations. Great-grandma Eleanor tried to break it by writing the truth in ink meant to outlast her voice. My grandmother tried to uphold it, but grew too frail to enforce it. My mother carried the truth quietly, perhaps hoping one day I would be strong enough to receive it. And eventually I was. If there is a lesson in what happened, it is this. Truth is patient. It waits for the moment we are brave enough to face it. Sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes vengeance is not cruel. Sometimes redemption comes simply from restoring what was always meant to be. I did not destroy my father. I did not punish my brothers. I did not burn bridges or seek revenge through ruin. I reclaimed what was taken, through documentation, clarity, and calm confrontation. Ethical revenge, if it exists, is nothing more than putting truth back in its rightful place. And now, when I walk the land at dusk and feel the earth settle beneath my feet, I know I am walking not only for myself, but for all the women whose voices were dismissed, overlooked, or overwritten. This land is my inheritance, but the truth behind it, that is my legacy. If you, listening to this, carry a truth you've been taught to doubt, know this: you do not owe your silence to anyone, and courage does not diminish with age. Sometimes the strongest voice in a family is the one that speaks last.